You're listening to episode 173 of The Secular Buddhist. Welcome to The Secular Buddhist. I'm Ted Meissner. The Secular Buddhist is the official podcast of the Secular Buddhist Association, a grassroots-driven effort to answer the needs of secular teaching and practice for contemporary society. The podcast has interviews and roundtable discussions pertaining to engaged Buddhist training and practice, and the SBA website has show notes for each episode along with resource materials. Though the podcast focuses on core practice from a secular viewpoint, more traditional teachings are welcome and openly discussed. Brad Warner joins us to speak about his new book, just released this week, There Is No God, and He Is Always With You. What do you think of when you hear the word God with a capital G? If you're from a Judeo-Christian background, particular images and ideas might come to mind. But is that a conceptualization that we should adhere to? Is it always in alignment with the intended meaning of the speaker? There are many different ways we can use this particularly charged word, some more traditional, others less so. The challenge is sometimes why use it at all, if our meaning is so very different from that core idea. Brad Warner is a Zen monk, writer, bass player, and filmmaker. He wrote the books Hardcore Zen, Sit Down and Shut Up, Zen Wrapped in Karma Dipped in Chocolate, and Sex, Sin, and Zen. He received Dharma transmission from Guru Nishijima Roshi, who received his transmission from Rempo Niwa Roshi, who, at the time, was head of the Soto sect in Japan. Brad was also a student of Tim McCarthy, who is also a student of Kobun Chino Roshi. So sit back, relax, and have a nice green tea. Yes, just green tea. And our guest today is Brad Warner. Brad, thanks for being here again.
Thank you for having me. Glad to be had.
Nice to talk to you again. And we're going to be talking about your new book, just released this week, There Is No God, and He Is Always With You. But before we get into that, let's talk about a couple things. You've been in LA since July, and last time we talked, that episode came out in fall. How's that been going?
It's been going great. The weather's, of course, lovely, and I don't know. I like Los Angeles. I moved to New York for a little while, and I thought I was going to be one of those people who liked New York better than Los Angeles, but I found out I'm not one of those people. I like the public transportation, and I like the vibe of New York and stuff. It's very cool, but I like Los Angeles better. What can I say?
Cool, good. I'm glad you're enjoying that. So, the new book. Tell us about that. What's it about? Because this one is a little bit different than the ones we've had from you before.
Yeah, I think it is a little different. It's about God, and it's specifically about the Zen Buddhist perspective on God, or at least my Zen Buddhist perspective on God. And I've been interested in the question of God for a long time, and every book that I've written, there's been some kind of examination of that point, but usually it's not the central theme of the book. But since it was such a central theme in my life, I thought it deserved a book of its own. So the funny origin of this, if you want to hear the funny origin, was I was casting around for ideas for another book because New World Library wanted one because Sex, Sin, and Zen had done well for them. So I proposed this thing. I said, I've been going to bookstores a lot, and I've seen all these books that are like the philosophy of Lost, or the philosophy of Star Trek, or the philosophy of Star Wars, or there's the philosophy of Dexter. There's all these sort of right. There's like these pop culture meet philosophy books, and they seem to be doing well for people, or they wouldn't be putting them out all the time. So I said, I know a lot about Godzilla. Maybe I could do one like the Zen of Godzilla, and the people at New World Library actually liked that idea. So I started writing it, but I got one chapter written, and then I kind of lost interest in it. There just wasn't that much to say. But I was looking at the file, because I write on a MacBook, and the files come in little, everybody knows what they look like, right? The files are little files with names on them, right? And it said the Zen of Godzilla, and I thought, wait a minute, what if I just did the Zen of God? That would be interesting.
Dropping off Zilla does amazing things to a word, doesn't it?
Yeah, so it became the working title was the Zen of God, and I started writing on that, and that actually was an idea that was far more interesting. And so yeah, that's it. And the book is it's a little different. People have been saying that it's a little different in tone from my previous books. I think it's because there's not a cartoon on the cover, and there are not so many Beavis and Butthead jokes. In fact, there are no Beavis and Butthead jokes.
I kept looking through it to find them, but they're not there in this one. Promise.
Yeah,
It's not there.
but I don't know if that was so much a deliberate as just kind of getting tired of doing that stuff, and it seemed to be getting a bit. You've done it, and now it's a bit old. I don't know if I've actually matured though, so people shouldn't worry too much.
That's actually in the writing itself, I got to say, in going through this one, as someone who has read the book, and special thanks to Kim Corbin for making that happen. You're the best Franklin planner person ever. Is you have matured as a writer, that the style itself is smoother, and the passion that you have about this topic in particular, because I know this is important to you from our other conversations, does show. And so even when approaching this as, from my perspective, as a newer but not antagonistic atheist, I got what you were saying, and you conveyed that in a very honestly Zen-like fashion. So I have seen a change in that, in the way you put it together.
Well, thanks, I guess. I think I like it. What can I say? I like it.
So let's talk for a second about definitions, because that's, of course, one of the trickier things when we're talking about, well, any topic, but especially one as robust and comprehensive as the idea of a deity.
Yeah.
When we're talking about this, you ran into a lot of different people's attitudes towards what God meant to them. What were some of the things that you ran into?
Well, when I first got this idea to write this book, I had been for a while, if maybe a couple of years, buying some of the neo-atheist books. I was actually spending money on Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens and who's the other guy, Sam Harris, and I found on the one hand I found a lot to like in their perspective, and I found that I agreed with most of it, but it was frustrating because, especially in the case of Richard Dawkins, he seems to be attacking a really, really shallow idea of God. That I know there are people who believe in that, and I know those people, when they're armed, can be very dangerous, and you don't want to let them loose on anything or running anything. But I think that there's a lot more to the notion of God than what people like Richard Dawkins are reacting against. It's not all just people naysaying evolution and trying to kill each other for believing the wrong things. I think there's something deeper there, and also I think in terms of Zen or Buddhist practice in general, we as Western people are steeped in this notion of God, and this is an interesting point historically in Buddhism, because Buddhism, until maybe the 20th century, never had to confront the idea of God, because it doesn't really exist in at least the same form in India, China, Korea, the places where Buddhism took root. And now Buddhism is taking root in the United States, England, Canada, uh, places in South America, places in Europe. These are places where there's already a strong idea of God, and those people who come to it, even somebody like me who was not raised in a religious family, I wasn't indoctrinated in any sort of God, but it was there. It was there for me, and so I started to think, well, this practice I'm doing does address the idea of God, and it's too simple to say that it denies the existence of God, because on the one hand it does, depending on your definition of God, deny it, but on the other hand it's looking at something very, very deep and profound, and you could even say holy. So, we gotta talk about that.
Yeah, yeah, and you bring up in the book itself. I'll quote you here. There are many possible answers to the question of whether it's possible to be a Buddhist, Zen or otherwise, and also believe in God. One answer could be that it depends on what you mean by God. Another could be that it depends on what you mean by Buddhist. A third could be that it depends on what you mean by believe. And you bring up in just those one section of text, one of the core problems is we often are talking about the same thing, and we're just getting gummed up by words, and we get too
Yeah.
attached to a particular ossified idea.
Yeah, I think so. I think a lot of the arguments about God are kind of semantic arguments, and you'd find that people have more agreement. But then, people try to solve those in various ways, and I think the most common these days is to say, okay, let's drop this word God, and that seems to be the solution for a lot of Buddhists. But I think that's kind of it works to some extent, but it's not the final answer. You really have to kind of go beyond that and say, okay, well, let's see what we mean by this.
So for you, what do you mean by God in your own experience? And understanding that everyone has their own particular way of looking at it. What's yours?
Uh, I let's see. It's difficult to define, because there isn't a good definition of God. But I feel like within my practice, I came to my practice curious about whether there could be a God or not, and I had some sort of ideas about God, and they were all wrapped up in different things. I remember when I was a teenager getting a hold of a Ouija board, and I thought if I could conjure up, yeah, I thought if I could conjure up Satan, then I would know that God existed. Therefore, I would kick Satan out and follow God. I thought that was a pretty clever notion, you know.
Mine was to stand on the porch during the rain and
Uh,
say something derogatory about God, and I didn't get hit by lightning, so that was my answer. Yours was less risky.
yeah, 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 maybe. But it didn't work. Satan did not appear.
Mine either. No lightning. Imagine.
Uh, but Now, what was the question? Oh, what do I mean by God? So, that was kind of a specific idea of God, and I rejected that idea, but I kept going into this practice, and the practice of opening up and doing what we do within Zen practice kind of made me aware of dimensions of my life as it is that were deeper, and that I don't think God is the wrong word for. That's kind of a funny way to say it. Um, I don't want to say God is the right word for it either, but there is something to this. existence, and it's real, and the universe that we live in is life is an intrinsic aspect of the universe, which I think if you're going to take a kind of materialistic view that a lot of the neo-atheists do, they seem to kind of get this idea that life is sort of arbitrary. It's something that happens when molecules and atoms form in just the right combinations, and then they start doing things, and then they go, oh, look, I'm alive. But I think it goes deeper than that. I think life is actually exists within the molecules and atoms themselves, and is manifested in so-called higher life forms like us in a specific way. But I think it's intrinsic within the universe, and that life could also be called God. I think when the people who first started positing the idea of God started using this word, I imagine that a lot of them, maybe not all of them, were searching for words to express this thing that they felt. But then of course people grab onto the word and lose the meaning. That's always one of our Zen cliches.
Finger pointing
Understand.
at the moon.
Yeah, finger pointing at the moon, or hearing the words grasp the meaning, I think is the other phrase that gets thrown around.
So, as one of those materialistic folks, which I proudly and openly claim, the question then becomes, and I hear what you're saying, and that is something that I have heard before. This sense of an embeddedness of life on a level that's more deep than the combination of molecules and continued evolution. The question we have for that: is there a particular thing in your life that convinces you of that points to that as something that is so, that particular explanation is the right one?
Well, there's a lot of things. One of the things I wrote about in the book was an experience that I wrote about in Hardcore Zen, and it basically, in a nutshell, I was walking across this little footbridge. I walked across every day to go to work, and this is after 15 or more years of practice, and something happened that day that I at once changed my life, but at once also kept it the same. And it was kind of a an important experience, but on the other hand, it's just another thing that happened in another case. But that's not really, I can't really even point to that moment as being the only thing. It sort of confirmed a lot of stuff all at once, but it also was a continuation of something that had been going on for a long time. It was like, oh, that's that feeling that I've had ever since I was a baby, and now I get a little bit of what it means or what it's about. And there's that, but there's a lot of people out there who have a lot of experiences. I even saw a flyer at a local Buddhist center that was like this, somebody's trying to collect videos of 10,000 awakening experiences and put them up on YouTube I don't know, to do what, I don't know. Um, and that gets a little silly.
So let's talk for a little bit. You mentioned Richard Dawkins and Sam Harris and Christopher Hitchens, who passed away not too long ago, and
Yeah.
Daniel Dennett would be the other of the four horsemen.
Oh, I don't know him, but okay.
Interesting, right? Conscious sciencey kinds of stuff. Well, as a philosopher,
Uh-huh.
you mentioned that you agree with some of the things that, for example, Richard Dawkins says, but not some of the others. And I was wondering if you'd care to share what some of the things of his that you did like, that made sense to you, and some of the things that you didn't like as much.
Well, it's hard to say now that it's been a while since I read any of those books, but basically the idea that science is valuable and can answer questions like when was the Earth formed, these kind of things better than the Bible, or your chosen book can answer them. I think that's valuable, and Although I think a lot of people already know that, but then again, of course, there are people who don't know that and need to be told. Um, I think that's good, and I think the idea of putting aside these kind of superstitions and things because they don't do us any good is also valuable. But then there are sort of other aspects of it where I think I wonder. For example, I got into a little discussion on my blog a little while ago talking about somebody brought up this guy Arthur Killer Kane, who was the bass player for the New York Dolls, who were kind of a pre they were pre-punk. They came out before punk rock really happened, but they were extremely influential because they had kind of a prototype of what became the punk sound. They were into drugs and horrible things, and Arthur and they broke up, and Arthur Kane drifted around for a long time, just getting more and more messed up with drugs and awfulness. Ended up in Los Angeles, and at a very low point, went to the Mormon Church on Santa Monica Boulevard. It's huge, and he had some kind of a profound experience. And he joined the Mormon Church, and they got him off the drugs, and he rejoined the New York Dolls, and they were very supportive of him doing that. And so on. It's a really there's a movie about it called New York Doll, and it's a really touching story because Arthur Kane apparently no one knew this at the time, but he had cancer at the time all this was going on, but it had gone undiagnosed, and he died like a month after the New York Dolls reunion show. But he died very happy, having finally gotten back his life back on track. And I thought, if somebody were to have gone to Arthur Kane, maybe a Richard Dawkins-ish type of character, and said, "Snap out of it, Arthur Kane, that thing you thought that was a divine experience of God in the Mormon Church, that was nothing but the firings of neurons in your brain. It had no significance." And if Arthur Kane had believed that, he'd probably have just gone on being a drug abusing ex rock star and may have died much quicker and not nearly as fulfilled and happy. So it makes me wonder, and to me the jury's out. I can't believe most of those things that come under the file of religious experience. But then again, when I tell my story, people think it's the story of my religious experience too. So who knows? But you know what I mean. I think it's good to be rational, and I think that's ultimately has a very is very important for human society. But there are things that go on in life that aren't rational. And we also have that aspect to ourselves, and we should honor that, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'd agree. I think there's a lot of value to rationality, and I'd say there's also a lot of irrationality in the world.
Yeah.
So you did a lot of traveling on this book. Tell us about your time in Israel in particular, because you start off with a section on that. And I'd like to hear more about that.
Well, what can I tell you? I was on a book tour. I think this was basically promoting Sex, Sin, and Zen, which was my previous book. Or I think in the book I kind of mixed up two tours that I did, but the Israel thing was for Sex, Sin, and Zen, and I'd gotten invited by a university in Tel Aviv to go do this talk. But I was very interested in going to Israel. I was not that interested in Tel Aviv. I was more interested in Jerusalem. So I had a friend who knew somebody who had a youth hostel that you could go. I guess I'm not that youthful, but they let me in anyway. But I went to this hostel, and I spent about a week in Jerusalem, on the Mount of Olives, in an area, in a little village there that's mostly Palestinian. There aren't not too many Jewish people up there in this village. And the guy who was hosting me was Palestinian, was a Muslim.
Ibrahim.
Yeah, Ibrahim. Really nice, interesting guy. And so I got to see a lot of things about religion. It was interesting that let me see if I'm getting this chronology right. I arrived in Israel after a week in Belfast. So I went directly from Belfast in to Jerusalem. So I was getting, and Belfast is also like Jerusalem, a city which is divided between two religions who are actually very alike when you really look at it. Catholics and Protestants. I mean, you could hardly find two more alike religions. And Jewish and Muslim really are not that different either, in a lot of very fundamental ways, and yet they divide people, and people get very angry and animated. But I find that most of the conflict didn't seem to be. People will define their conflict in those two cities and elsewhere in religious terms or in terms of God. But if you don't have to be a genius to figure out that most of what they're talking about has nothing to do with God, or even conceptually. It's about sort of turf wars and these kind of things. It doesn't, they're using God as an excuse. And you can see where that would make a lot of people very suspicious of God. This was especially true, and the people in Belfast are very likely to be open with their atheism. And the Jewish people in Israel are kind of open with their atheism. It's not quite as safe to be an openly atheist in the Muslim areas, but I got the impression from some of the people that I did interact with over there that they're skeptical too. Their religion has kind of let them down, but it's a tradition that they follow because it's a tradition, and it's what the family does. So it was an interesting experience, and I've long had a fascination with the life of Jesus. Not being a Christian myself, but I find it really interesting. So it was great to walk around there and go, oh, it's great. Here's where the crucifixion took place. Oh no, wait a minute. 150 feet down the road, there's another place where the crucifixion took place. But I found one of them to be a lot nicer than the other, so I liked that one better.
The nicer place where someone was crucified.
Yeah. The Garden Tomb is much nicer than the Holy, what's it called? Holy Sepulchre, I think is what it's called. That one's dark and grim, but the Garden Tomb is bright and cheery, and both of them claim to be the site of the crucifixion. So it's really interesting.
So the book has come out this week. You had a streaming event last night. How did that
Yeah.
go? Tell us a little bit more about that.
Well, that was interesting. That was the first time I ever tried. I did do one streaming thing before, and it was much more low key. We didn't advertise it much, so only 4 people actually joined it, and it was more manageable. So this was bigger. I invited a lot of people. It's a virtual thing, and a lot of people were there and chiming in with questions and stuff. It's an interesting way to communicate because I've been and remain kind of dubious of the internet. I think the internet can do great things, but it's also got huge gaps and gaping kinds of limitations that people will ignore. And I think we need to pay attention to that. So it was interesting because I actually went. My friend Rachel wanted to go see Amma, who was speaking at the Hilton, the airport Hilton, speaking. Not she wasn't really speaking; she was doing hugs, right? That's what she does. And so I took my laptop out there and did it there. So I'm in among all these Amma people, and no one but me could really tell what was going on. So the people are walking by, and it just looks like I'm talking randomly into my computer. But of course, you see that a lot these days. So I think people are sort of forgiving. I don't look insane. But what I was talking about was God, and people kept sort of inching over to me, sort of pretending to do something else, and kind of cocking their ear, going, "What's that guy talking about?" And I could see it out of the corner of my eye, but I couldn't really engage them because I was sort of trying to stay with the people who were watching me online. But that was interesting because I had to wonder what I must have sounded like to the Amma followers.
So how about the folks who attended? Was there participation back and forth? Are they able to comment and?
Yeah, there was a lot of good questions. It's difficult. I need I'm going to try doing it again some to get a feel for how to do it efficiently because I'm just looking at a screen that on the left side has me and so I can see what I look like. And then on the right side is just a list of questions that people are typing in and sending. But the questions were coming by too fast for me to I'd start answering one and then 10 more would pop up and I'm kind of feeling bad, like, oh, I can't answer those 10 more questions because I'm still working on this one. Uh, so I may have to figure out a more efficient way to do that. I hope people, were satisfied with my answers, but some people were really trying to engage me. And there's a guy I met named Matt Williams. He was part of this thing I did in Spain last year called the International Lay Buddhist Forum, where they had non-monastic Buddhists get together and talk about their stuff. And it was sponsored by Cambridge University in the UK, and so there were like I think 5 students from the university showed up, and Matt was one of those. So these students were all early 20s, but they were at Cambridge, so they were pretty smart to begin with, and they were deeply interested in questions of spirituality and religion. So it was interesting to have conversations with them. In fact, I hung around with them more than I hung around with anybody else because they were a lot more interesting than the kind of stodgy professors and things who were the rest of the group.
Okay. You're also starting a living room tour. Tell us about that.
The living room tour is something. Apparently, it's big with the neo folk crowd of musicians who are folk musicians. Meaning, I don't know what folk music means anymore. It just means acoustic guitars instead of electric. But stylistically, it's all over the map. But anyway, a lot of these folk musicians are going around doing these living room tours where they just carry a guitar and they park themselves in somebody's house and speak to invited guests. And I thought, well, I could do something like that. And my friend Piruz Kalea, who is making a movie about me, he kindly volunteered and stepped up and organized it all. He took emails from people and we set it all up. And I'm going out next Tuesday, less than a week. It's a scary proposition because I have no idea if this is gonna. I think it'll be fun, but it's a much more extensive tour than I've ever done. In the sense, it's not as I've done 6 and 8 week tours before, but this is very condensed because we've got an event going every single day. It's 12 days, and some days I've got 2 events on the same day. Um, in fact, one day I think I've got 3. So it'll be interesting to see if I don't just die of exhaustion. And I'm driving myself. I'm going out there on my own. I'm depending on people to donate when they show up and see one of these talks. We're going to pass the hat around to get gas money to go to the next place. And if I don't get enough gas money, then I got to pay for it. But I think it'll be an interesting way to actually connect with the people who are really concerned about the subjects that I write about, because a lot of times I get booked in these, I don't want to put them down or disparage them, but I'll get booked in these kind of new age bookstores, which have a Buddhism section, and they have a crystal gazing section, and they have, your Gnostic Christianity section, and they have all kinds of stuff. So I'm drawing from a population in those places that aren't necessarily, they're curious about what I've got to say, but they're not necessarily deeply interested in it.
Yeah,
So
they're not educated Zen practitioners who do this
yeah,
on a regular basis. Yeah, yeah.
yeah, and and there's interesting things in both audiences though. So I'm going to do some of that stuff as well.
You also mentioned the movie, and we talked about that a little bit in the last interview in episode 138 when we were talking about Hardcore Zen Strikes Again. How's that going?
The movie is called the title so far of the movie is Brad Warner's Hardcore Zen, which was sort of like a compromise that the director liked, but which I'm not so happy about. But whatever.
What did you want
It'll,
instead?
it'll do. Well, I don't know. We batted around ideas. There was one for a while. It was called the Enlightenizer, but I thought that was too. I kind of put the end to that because I thought that's too weird.
Yeah, good. Thanks.
Yeah. But he's been following me around for about, I think it's been 3 years almost. Because when Hardcore Zen first came out, and maybe I told the same story last time, but Hardcore Zen came out, and immediately I got inquiries from people who wanted to make a movie out of it, which is something I guess happens when you've got a book that sells any quantity. So I was fielding those, but what I found very quickly is that the people I was talking to weren't all that serious. A lot of what happens in that industry is people trying to get the jump on the other guy. So if they think somebody else might option the movie, they want to option it first and then take the money from the guy who's really going to make the movie. So I got a few of those. And after a while, after about the fourth one, I started taking them much less seriously. So Piruz came along and said he wanted to do a movie, and I kind of said, okay, well, I'm going to be talking next week. If you want to bring your cameras along, you can do it, thinking I'll never hear from this guy again. And the next week, he showed up with his cameras, and I said, oh, so this guy is serious, which was really interesting. And he kept doing that. He was mostly self-financed, so he was doing it in bits and pieces while working other jobs. But finally, he got enough stuff and he put it together. And I saw the cut of it about, I don't know, 2 weeks ago or something, and I like it. It's weird. It's not necessarily the most flattering portrait one could come up with for me, but that's kind of why I like it, because it's it shouldn't be too fawning or anything. It should be. I kept trying to get him to get some of the people who have been very outspoken anti-Brad Warner critics, and none of them. I found email addresses and things and phone numbers even. And he contacted several of them, but none of them would speak on camera, which I thought was too bad. So we have them represented in the film through, quotes that they said appear on screen and stuff, and we kind of got that in there. But I really wanted them to actually come and speak on camera and say, if they felt that passionately that I was leading people astray, let's hear it.
Yeah.
Let's hear it.
Yeah, that would have been very interesting to have in the film. Well, your living room tour is about to start, and for folks who are listening to the podcast, you can find out the specifics of that. I presume, Brad, you've got it on your site, which is hardcorezen.info. So folks listening, be sure to go there, find out the details on it. If you can go. It'll be a lot of fun to see Brad and get a chance to find out more directly about the book itself. Our guest today, Brad Warner. Brad, thanks for being here. Appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to learn more about something you've heard in today's podcast, please come visit the SBA website at secularbuddhism.org, and you'll find an entire webpage devoted to this and every episode. Discussion about this episode can be found on the episode page itself, along with show notes. The music for The Secular Buddhist is used by permission from John Kaizan Neptune's CD, Steps in Time. Additional music is provided courtesy of Monty Levinson of Taihei Shakuhachi and Rodrigo Rodriguez. Their websites are also linked on the SBA site on the About Podcast Music page. Until next time, remember, every moment you have a choice. Make it the best you can. See you next time on The Secular Buddhist.